A2IM, the collective voice of independent music.
So thank you for everybody for tuning into this. This is the International Global Marketplace Overview for the U.S. My name is Kodi McKinney. I'm the partner and co-founder at Marauder, which is a music marketing firm based here that develops artists and organizations from all over the world within North America. Incidentally, we're also producing Indie Week with A2IM this year. Now, essentially what we're doing here is we're taking a look at the overall U.S. market and, particularly how it relates to, independent labels, artists, everybody who could be wanting to get into it. And, one of the first things that you should know about the U.S. market in general is that it is the biggest music market in the world, especially within English-speaking parameters. It is also easily the most difficult of all of them to break into. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of that is, overarching competition, where, essentially, if you're trying to get into, Spain, for example, and you're talking to, either English or Spanish press there, you're dealing with a much more limited panel than if you were dealing with press here. Here you can, if you're a press writer, for example, you can see 300 pitches a day, and that's considered to be pretty standard. So the threshold for what you have to do to actually get in here is higher. There's more establishment of, an artist's career relevance and existence that needs to be done. And overall, it can take quite a lot of time and money. The expense of hiring, a U.S. publicist, for example, is, usually double what you would expect to be paying for a UK publicist. These things are all good to understand. And so, I try to kind of scare people up front with how difficult the market is because, the payoff itself is so massively tempting. Obviously, if you get to the point that you have a U.S. career, you could spend the rest of your career working in the U.S. where you've got 300 plus million, people who you can be speaking to. And that can be your entire economic driver. I mean, this covers a surface area that's comparable to, the entire European continent. It's just an absolutely enormous country. So that's one of the things we should talk about next is what's different here in the U.S. aside from, obviously things being tougher. Well, for one thing, when we talk about local markets, in the way that, you would look at France or Germany, and, you would think about these as individual territories. You would think about, okay, well, I can call this person in France to get a record fully set up, or I can call this person in Germany and they can tell me, to what extent this matters to the market. And they can talk to a couple of radio programmers and they could talk to, some people about getting us a show there and these other sorts of things. It's kind of hard to find that person in the States. And we try to be that to people, but, ultimately it's just a much larger, puzzle piece to tackle. So let's talk about that. Every local market in the States, and I'm talking about not just New York City, not just Los Angeles. I'm also talking about Pittsburgh. I'm talking about Cleveland. I'm talking about Cincinnati. I'm talking about these cities that, are very part and parcel of the U.S. discussion, but often get kind of ignored at first because they're a little bit trickier on paper to crack into. All of these cities, this all covers the same surface area as, any one state covers a surface area that's equivalent to, in many cases, a smaller European country. These are, so you're driving dates between potential tour stops, the overall work that you have to do to get from point A to point B is extensive. And, you can spend 6 hours driving between gigs if you don't have things set up correctly. So there's quite a lot of threading the needle that needs to be done. We also have, our immensely tricky immigration system, which was tricky even before the current administration, and now it's really tricky. So that's one of the other things that you always have to think about and navigate here. Now, obviously, in our current pandemic enforced climate, some of the puzzles of, oh, okay, well, how do we get here to play in July? Those are not necessarily as immediate questions as they used to be. This works in your favor more than you might expect, because it can take anywhere between 6 months to a year to set up a first U.S. run for somebody who's already getting U.S. traction. So let's talk a little bit about marketing here. From a marketing standpoint, a lot of the people that you would use in any other territory, you're suddenly having to go to multiple people. And, again, to bring ourselves into this somewhat, we try to streamline that as best we can and kind of play the overarching project manager role. But, there are a lot of cases where that's just not necessarily feasible for a particular artist or a particular label situation. You're not only trying to market across different teams that all have quite a lot of ground to cover, and that's whoever's working on radio promo, that's whoever's doing publicity, your distributor who's working in the territory, everybody that is involved with your campaigning. All these people are essentially unified under that umbrella of working for you, but it also means that you have some pretty lengthy chains on emails and that sort of thing to go to. And it's really easy for any one of them to have information that gets lost. So you have to be twice as organized as the people that you're working with to get the most out of the territory. And the good ones that you're working with will know that and will rise to the occasion, but you always have to be mindful of it. From that perspective, the other thing that's a little bit tricky about marketing here is that in other territories, you can drop singles and drip those out over the period of a year or two, and you will get almost all the traction you could ever possibly need. The most severe case of that I'm aware of is Australia, where if you put out one single that's really great in Australia, suddenly your career can take off, and the next 6 months, things will be moving so fast that you can't even slow down, and you're getting all the festival invites and everything. That's very different here. It's an incredible lightning strike of a thing to have a single in the US that gets the kind of traction where suddenly your career is taking off faster than you know what to do with. What's more common here is that singles instead are usually a setup mechanism where you find, maybe a couple of people who might find your new song interesting, maybe a couple of radio stations think it's good. Almost all the people from a media marketing standpoint are waiting for a bigger release. They're waiting for an EP to come out. They're waiting for an album to come out. And part of that is because they like to work that way. And part of that is because they want to make sure you're for real, because they're getting so much attention from so many different places all the time that if they're going to spend the time covering you, they want to make sure that you're still here 2 years from now, because otherwise they can't look back and say, I championed this before anybody did. And that hurts their tastemaker credibility. So that's one of the reasons things are so difficult when you're talking about singles here and the first steps that you take here. So every little win that you get, whether it's a small blog writing about your artist, whether it's a radio station saying, I really like what this label sent me. Can you tell me what else they do? Where are they from? Like, I think this is amazing. Whatever those little wins are, every one of them has to be quantified and made the most of that you can. And that's one of the really important things about the marketing strategy here, because, a lot of times you can just kind of do the single thing forever. Here you have to show the real marketing plan. You have to be able to say, 3 months from now, this EP is coming. 6 months from now, this album is coming. And I'm not throwing hard times in here. Those are example times. But you always have to be working towards larger projects, larger records, larger tours that you want to do. Your first, New York, LA showcases, your South by Southwest showcase, if it makes sense. Don't have to do that. These types of things, any little thing that you're doing in the territory, what you do around it to start getting into these secondary and tertiary cities, college towns, the smaller markets that still have football teams, that sort of thing. These are all really important things from a touring perspective. And these are the types of things that will allow you to actually go through the immigration process and be able to say, hey, we have dates that are on the table here. Here's what people have said about us so far. Here are people in the U.S. vouching for us as being a legitimate entity. Here's everything you should know. And I'm not a lawyer, for immigration purposes, I always advise that people talk to Kodi Law or Tamizdat, which is the nonprofit aspect of Kodi Law. They're always worth your time to do. And I generally, I like to kind of reference two people at once when I'm talking about anything that I would refer you to, but they're the best at what they do. And they help a large majority of the artists that come in here. So going a little bit more to, what comes next from that, because this is strictly an overview. And if we get into, some of the aspects of how promo works and all that here, we could be here for a while. Going into what comes next, you're trying in the territory, you're trying to, get some attention, and you're wondering maybe why things aren't working. One reason for that oftentimes is localization. If you're, say, a French artist and your lyrics are heavily in French or English that doesn't translate the way that it should, that also happens. If you're in that position, it can be really difficult to be accepted as one of the artists within this territory. Everyone's trying to figure out zeitgeist is in the U.S. There's people who are trying to figure out, what does this all mean? And if you're coming in from the outside saying, hey, we're an artist from Italy, and we're the greatest thing that's ever happened, and we're going to change rock and roll, they're going to look at you and say, really? You sure? Prove it. And that's just the nature of how all of these things go with the States, because the States ultimately has this Americentrism to it, for better or for worse, where we say, okay, and somehow all of music history goes through here. You think about the British invasion, one of the things that's so remarkable about the British invasion is that it coming to America is so much of what changed how we think of things. And there's still a lot of people who have that type of ingrained culture within the Western world in terms of what's moving within music right now. So keeping an eye on how you're localizing yourself, how you're speaking the language of the territory around you, how your social posts, if you're an artist that is, let's say you're a Japanese artist, and your social posts, you're starting to use English as a language that you do some of your posts in. This is good localization. These types of things can also be done for any of your press materials, for any of the various things that people need from you. Your distributor can work with local with all of the DSPs within the area on what makes sense from a local perspective and how it's relevant to local markets. So you're not just on your home country's playlist all the time too. And marketing drivers that you can give them are really important in that. So it's a very complex puzzle. And quite frankly, if we devote an hour to it, that would probably be a little bit easier, but it would also still be a ream of information. In the meantime, what we're talking about is essentially an overview of everything that you need here. And so the takeaways that I want you to have from this conversation are: don't enter into the US lightly. It can be very expensive. If you're going to come here, if you're going to have a label that's operating here, that's building real clout in the territory, think about who your partners are. Think about how you're marketing yourself, and be prepared for it to take a year or more, because that's often how much time you need just to cut through the noise. In a lot of cases, you can do a little thing somewhere else in the world and everyone goes, oh, this is fascinating. This is part of the global conversation. The US says it wants the global conversation, and oftentimes what they really mean is they want the global conversation through the prism of the local conversation. And so understanding how you're speaking to the US in everything that you do will get you much, much farther. And yeah, that's it for me.